It was to be the southernmost colony in the Empire, one set up to service a reborn British whaling fleet deep in the sub-Antarctic waters, 500 kilometres south of New Zealand. The concept appeared sound on paper. Instead of a 4-month journey one way from England, whaling vessels would be serviced at the docks and slipway at Port Ross at the north of the Auckland Islands, provisioned with fresh killed meat from the farms, supplied with vegetables from the gardens, refitted and repaired with timber from the forest. These vessels would return only when their loads of oil were full. This was the brainchild of one Charles Enderby in the middle of the 1840s. It was his grandfather, Samuel, who pioneered the British whaling industry. The new settlement would look up the harbour onto Enderby Island. The new settlement, a whaling-cum-farming township, was to be called Hardwick, named after one of the main benefactors and directors, Charles York, the 4th Earl of Hardwick, a salty ex-Royal Navy commander and Conservative Party member. Not content with producing 8 children of his own, his scandalous liaisons with teenage servants got him well into double figures. The company behind the venture was the Southern Whale Fishery Company, and Charles Enderby was its main driver and chief spruiker. He set about seeking both investors as well as scouring England for the citizens with the necessary skill set to start a self-sufficient community 5 days sailing to the nearest piece of civilization. Surveyors, bricklayers, carpenters, doctors, seamstresses, farmers, etc. He made sure all the bases would be covered, and to ensure it wasn't a men-only preserve, he gave priority to young families, dangled the allure of an untapped island, and with those with enterprise could get on the ground floor for no cost at all. Here, let's work our way down so we know about where we're talking. Starting from where the Auckland Islands are, located on the high seas. The islands and location of the settlement. Now, better view of Port Ross. Lastly, the floor plan for the village and port, etc. In August 1849, 3 chartered vessels left England for Port Ross. Beside Enderby and the crew, there were 56 settlers, 36 men, 16 women and 14 children, 30 kit-set buildings and supplies for about the first 3 months. From the very moment land was sighted, after a harrowing 4.5-month journey that involved mass sickness and crew infighting, that first overcast and misty day that greeted the vessels as they gingerly worked their way into Port Ross, the dream began turning into a nightmare for all those concerned. Enderby's brochure and pub lectures to audiences painted Auckland Islands as having an environment similar to those of the Shetland Islands. That in itself was hardly a recommendation, by the way. What he had conveniently left out was it rained 300 days a year, and there was a howling wind that ceaselessly battered the island from the west. Gusts would reach 60 kilometres an hour 3 out of 4 days. 60 kilometres an hour on the Beaufort scale is rated as a whole gale, and that scale is above strong gale. If it wasn't enough for you to rummage in the wardrobe already to locate your puffer jacket to combat the weather, I'm leaving the worst till last. Sunshine or lack of it. Half of Glasgow in a good year. The island was perpetually covered in mist and cloud. In the depths of winter, islanders could expect just 10 to 15 hours of sunshine per month. I've deliberately only included black and white photos in this video to add to the dreariness of the whole escapade, Hammer horror style. Not only had Enderby deliberately embellished the climatic attributes, he'd done the same with the land. Described the island and those surrounding it as to, quote part of his brochure,
land that is exceedingly healthy and with rich virgin soil capable of feeding on 1 acre 6 sheep compared to those in Australia. The soil was capable of growing the same produce as one would see in a normal garden.
All of which was hyperbole and outright falsity. The soil was peaty and produced a fraction of the vegetables needed. The growing season, if you could call it that, was measured in weeks. Later vessels came with livestock in terms of 300 sheep and 80 cows, which promptly went feral and would have been now impossible to recapture on the dense low-hanging rata thickets on Auckland Island itself. Enderby Island they went, which wasn't much better, but at least they had a few acres of marginal grazable land. Fascinatingly, the last of the surviving population of what became called the Enderby cattle were transferred to New Zealand in 1991. These stout small cows had survived by eating rata and seaweed. A single adult female and her heifer calf had rescued the breed from extinction. Seaweed was also the diet of feral pigs, goats and rabbits deposited randomly on the Auckland Islanders in 1806 to become the emergency feed for anyone shipwrecked there. The distinctive descendants of the Enderby Island rabbits are a similar case to the cattle, a selection of which were saved from eradication and are bred today. Wild pigs ate so much seaweed that when shot their meat was all but unedible. For those of you familiar to mutton birds, you'll get the general gist. Within a month of arriving, the writing was already on the wall. By then the settlers knew their housing was inadequate for the weather. They were still confined to the boats for shelter, and they weren't actually the only occupants of the islands either. 40 Maori from the Ngāti Mutonga iwi were there first, along with 25 Moriori slaves from the Chatham Islands. They'd already been there for 7 years, and to the relief of the expedition were friendly. Even better, a barter system ensued. The Maori inhabitants, being more adept at growing cabbages and kumara, provided labour and later served on as policemen. A symbiotic relationship ensued that benefited both parties. One solitary positive to a long list of adverse setbacks. Still, there was always that prime industry to rely on, right? Whaling. On that score, they had literally missed the boat. Charles Enderby and everyone else involved with the Southern Whale Fishery Company had underestimated the effect earlier whaling had had on the population. The British fleet itself was a shadow of its former self, and just 14 vessels, or 40 times less than the US one, half of which were now deployed in the seas in and around the Aucklands. It was a ragtag fleet, manned by crew that could be dubbed less than desirable. This fact would soon become apparent to the townspeople of Hardwick, particularly its women and anyone else who entered what passed as its pub. At one point, scurvy and dysentery broke out on one vessel, and that had to return to Port Ross to seek treatment for the crew. The worst crew members were led ashore and quarantined. Unfortunately, a sailor died at Hardwick's hospital, mainly due to the incompetence of the island's doctor, who was permanently pissed. Catches were continually poor. In late 1850, 12 odd months after arriving first onto the island, the Governor-General of New Zealand at the time, Sir George Grey, was dispatched to get an update as to how Hardwick was boxing along. His visit coincided with weather that would be termed shit, even by the locals. Let me sum up Grey's appraisal a year into the venture in one word. The first 12 months of income for the settlement was listed as £3,000. Expenditure for the town alone, not including the fleet and crew, I must add, £30,000. Meanwhile, Enderby was constantly talking it up to the shareholders back in England, as the whole thing was falling apart at the seams. Life for the Maori and settlers was miserable. Only a fraction of Auckland Island was rendered farmable, 5 odd acres. Enderby Island was viewed as the only place inhabitable for domesticated animals, and as I've pointed out before, they were simply deposited there to do their thing. People were also going stir-crazy stuck on such a remote location. In January of 1851, two desperate to get off local men hatched a plan to steal a boat and hightail it to New Zealand. They only made it to Rose Island at the end of the harbour, wrecking the boat in the process. For the locals, their only minor relief from being cooped up and contact with the outside world came in the form of whale hunting vessels out of Australia. The supply vessels may frequently have forgotten staples like flour and shoes. The latter were, after a while, being rudimentarily cobbled together from seal skins out of necessity. They never came empty of hard liquor. For relief, people turned to the bottle, men and women, the whole kit and caboodle. These stories from journals of the time read something like out of the comedy movie The Hangover, only they were for real. Nevertheless amusing to those with a sixth sense of humour. which, lucky for you, happens to be me. Because I don't want to go over an hour with this regaling you as to the drunken rivalness that occurred at Hardwick. I'll confine my examples to the so-called medical professionals at Hardwick. I've already touched on the island's perpetually pissed surgeon John Rudd. Well, he nearly drowned after falling off the wharf, and the locals got so sick of his increasingly violent outbursts that they set up a hut-cum-prison surrounded by water on a barren outcrop called Shoe Island. This makeshift dryer shed that resembled little more than a giant outhouse became better known as Rudd's Castle. Rudd's offsider, medical officer John McNish, was also a major pisshead, and reading between the lines, he also began sampling some of the drugs at his disposal. Enderby gave him his marching orders on the first ship out of there, or face time on Shoe Island. His replacement was William Ewington, who, upon arrival, spotted he was treating mostly patients with alcohol-inflicted injuries, and as a result decided he better tone down his own consumption for his tenure. Only his wife wasn't singing from the same hymn book and became somewhat of a drunken harlot, leading him to pay for her to leave the island alone. In the end, they left together. Wait, there's more to come in the subsection of Hardwick strata, the upper class, by the way. There was also Dr. Hallett. His sister tried to shoot him dead in a drunken rage after kicking in his door, and then turned the gun on herself in a suicide bid, and failing both times. The brother and sister eventually patched things up enough to both be excommunicated on the same boat after exhibiting mental health issues. Don't worry, they did try and limit alcohol consumption. A vote was held to ban boozing altogether. It got the support of just 6. Not that it was all bad when it came to relationships. 5 weddings were held at Hardwick. One of those was between a seaman, Robert Bishop, to the daughter of Ngāti Mutonga chief Hannah Taurarangi. 16 births also occurred. After 2.5 years and a fruitless hunt for whales, the investors pulled the plug and everyone prepared to leave the island. August 1852. The buildings and anything salvageable was broken down and shipped to Sydney to be auctioned. The majority of the Europeans ended up in Australia or back in England. Despite the proximity, only a few, mostly families, headed to New Zealand. The now penniless Charles Enderby chose his homeland as his destination. He died there in 1876. 2 years later, even the original inhabitants had had a gutsful. Mary bailed up north to New Zealand, and the Morioris were released from their servitude at the same time and travelled back to the Chathams. One thing Enderby did leave us with was the only mental image we have about what Hardwick looked like. The watercolour on your screen right now was painted by him. You'll notice it was a sunny day. And Hardwick today, what remains of it? And just this lonely, yet somewhat fitting, a small graveyard. A few odd bricks if you scrounge about. If you want another good story about privations down south and places cold, with a huge Kiwi link, a cute cat called Mrs. Chippy, which is sure to double my views, be sure to check out the video I did on Shackleton's carpenter, Harry McNish. If I've done things right, doubtful, given my own ineptitude, it will follow straight after this, or look in the description. Hardwick is a subject for a far larger production team, with a budget more than mine, 0. It would make a compelling docodrama, I think. I might also apply for a bit part. I can see myself as a drunken sailor. Bye for now.